think now is a good time to start. So let's start right here. Welcome to The Art of Wargaming presents how to apply military theory to combat theory, or to game theory. I suppose I should probably look at this. So when I'm talking about wargaming, we're talking about all sorts of wargaming. We're talking about stuff that you do online, first-person shooters, real-time strategy. We're talking about physical wargaming, stuff like the SCA or Bellegarth, if y'all taught the demos yesterday. And we're also talking about stuff like tabletops, like War Machine and Warhammer. These are all things that fall under the category of wargaming and kind of have the same application that we would see on other things. Now, as I'm going through this isn't supposed to be just a lecture. If y'all have something to contribute, or if you have a question or anything, just shoot that hand up, and this is a conversation back and forth. I absolutely have at least an hour worth of material prepared, but I'm also not expecting to get through all of it because this is all about the conversation. I am not the foremost authority on any of this, nor any of the guys we study, because I go back and I read a lot of old books, and even those guys are not the foremost authority. There's always new things, always new thoughts. And that's kind of the point of the show, is we go back, and it's my job to read a bunch of old books and translate them for a modern audience. This is not to imply that a modern audience is not intelligent, but there is a difference between intelligence and education. Take Shakespeare, for example. Most people go back and read Shakespeare and they go, I don't know what I just read. That's largely gibberish. But that's not because people are stupid, it's because people don't speak Middle English. And so without that training, without the education, it is hard to actually understand the knowledge that is being presented to us. And that's very much the same with a lot of these old books. For instance, Clausewitz is one of the ones that we're studying right now. And if you've ever looked at Clausewitz's On War, I mean, that thing is a lethal weapon unto itself. It is thick. And the guy was Prussian, so it's radio instructions for warfare. And so it's kind of hard to get through.
Standard Prussian.
Standard Prussian, correct. But I actually think that Clausewitz is a better starting point for new people to the subject than somebody like Napoleon. Because Napoleon says really simple things. Napoleon will say something like, an army marches on its stomach. Pretty simple sounding in and of itself. However, he's saying that to his chiefs of staff. He's saying that to his generals. He's not saying it to us. He's not thinking 150 years in the future, some nerds are going to be assembled talking about this. I need to make it accessible. No, that's not what it was for. Those words were written for specific people during a specific time. And so to really understand what they mean, we have to understand the cultural context. We have to understand why this is being said within the logistical system, because the logistics at the time were totally different than they are now. And so that statement, an army marches on its stomach, is actually far more pregnant with information than it sounds. Meanwhile, Clausewitz, he will describe to you the third bolt on the 9th wagon of the 6th company that is coming up from behind. I mean, the guy is detailed. But because of that, it actually makes it kind of easier to understand in a lot of ways. So be careful of simplistic information, because a lot of time it's what we call inferred information. For instance, when you read Frederick the Great's works, he specifically in the introduction says, this is for my generals. Do not let this get out, because it's for my people who have been educated in a certain way and approach war in a certain way. So that's my job. My job is to read all the old books, to understand the cultural context, and translate it for a modern audience, which is the art of wargaming. And that kind of touched on our first subject, which was that difference between educated knowledge and inferred knowledge. And neither of these things have anything to do with intelligence, just with training and education. So before we get started, there's one thing that needs to be understood. Anybody who's ever read any works on military science will know that the most fundamental thing about any of it is surprise. All warfare is based in deception. If your opponent knows what you're doing, you've already lost. Because then they have a chance to counter, then they have a chance to understand what you're doing and come up with a worthwhile counterattack to what you're doing. And so deception is all we need to do. Same thing with defense. If our opponent knows exactly where we've set up a minefield, for instance, what's to stop them from walking around it? And so such a thing needs to be placed in some manner of deception. And so understanding that is crucial to any of the wargaming that we all do. So when it comes to wargaming, we've got the two different types primarily. We've got physical types of wargaming, which is like Bellegarth or the SCA. And then we've got intellectual wargaming, which is things for like a console or on the tabletop. Who here does some sort of physical wargaming? Right on. Intellectual wargaming for everybody else, I assume? Yep. And so what y'all are seeing in that is a more bird's eye view. It's a far more of an objective sort of view. Even if you're playing something like a first-person shooter, you still have that little reticle off to the side that says, this is where my teammates are, this is kind of what's going on. And so it's actually a far, you have a better, like I said, objective view of things from that point of view. And so this first section applies mostly to physical warfare, but it can still be kind of translated to the other. So, like we said, all warfare is based in deception. As you probably know, being a physical war gamer, one of the things that is actually important is physical fitness. You know, we don't often think about that because, you know, it's just a bunch of nerds out there swinging stick, right? But it is also a physical activity. If you're wanting to be out there for 4, 6 hours in a given day, we should probably be in shape in some way, otherwise we're gonna hurt ourselves. And, you know, it's pretty simple to stay in shape for these things. Cardio and endurance is probably the most important thing, and the thing that I struggle with most. I'm not trying to be a hypocrite here. I understand that stuff can be hard. Strength training is another one. And I mean strength training not with weights, because you're never going to be doing this on the field of battle. Training with some sort of weighted weapon is far more crucial for that, because it lets your body get used to the motions you're going to actually be using, instead of training muscles that you might not actually use for the activity that you're doing. And then forms. Forms is very important as well. Like any of the physical war games have something that they draw from, some sort of form, some sort of kata that can be done. And what this does is that you'll never actually do that form in an actual battle. And I'm never going to use all 12 shots in a row. That's one of the forms that I do for it. I'm never going to just do them all in a row. That would be incredibly inefficient considering where they are. But training my body where those shots are supposed to be, that's the important part. Okay, I'm going to throw a 5. I've thrown a 5 10,000 times. I know how to go for that straight set and stab. And so that's what the point of the forms is to get a familiarity with the motion, not necessarily to do it all at one time. This isn't Hollywood. You know, this is live combat. This is something that's going down right in the moment. So this is where we start to get into the part where we can incorporate more of the intellectual wargaming too. We need to know how to read our opponent, because just like deception is a weapon on our part against our opponent, so too is it when it's used against us. Excuse me. So our first course of action is to try to determine what our opponent is going to do and how they're going to get there. The best way to do this is through experience. We have that over the people who actually wrote these books, because if they went out with their army and they encountered one of their opponents and they just got slammed and their army basically gets wiped, they're like, okay, I understand my opponent. I have no way to get back anymore because my people are dead and I'm probably captured, but I understand my opponent now. We get the benefit of being able to go against people over and over and over again. The people that we practice with fighting, for instance, we get to learn their moves. We get to learn kind of their strategy. The people that we play our games against frequently, we also get to do the same thing. And so we are given a unique opportunity and advantage to really study our opponent. How do they react under pressure? How do they react when this place is hit, or this place is hit? You know, are they more defensive with the right or the left? These little things, these little tells, can help us really understand what our opponent is doing and how to counteract them. And once we understand that, we strike the weaknesses, don't we? You know, if I find out that I've got a opponent in physical wargaming who is bad at covering their kidney, I'm left-handed. And so a lot of times right-handed people do not expect me to go after their kidney over and over and over again. And so a lot of the flaws in a right-handed person's stance has nothing to do with their actual skill, but mostly to do with their experience. Again, and as a left-handed player, I know this, and I try to exploit that weakness. Now, in Stigio, which is where I practice, we have a lot of left-handed fighters, so it doesn't work so well here locally. But when I travel, I get to pull those moves on people a lot better. And we do this again by testing defenses. Where are people pushing back the most? What do they want, and what do they sacrifice? Because the things that they want, the things that they actually defend, those are the things we actually want to go after, not the places where they heal. Because obviously that place wasn't worth defending. And on the other side, we want to avoid being red. And that's the other idea of this. So how do we do that? How do we move from one place into another? Well, we've got our baits and our feints. This was used all throughout ancient and modern warfare as well, saying, I'm over here, when actually you're planning on striking over here. One of my favorite ways of exploiting that kidney shot, for instance, is when we start up high, and you look at that shoulder. I keep my eyes focused on that shoulder, and I move like I'm going after the shoulder, and it's just a drop down into the kidney. Because of the way I'm looking, because of the way I'm stancing, my opponent is going to try to cover what they think is my target, when it is not, actually. And we can do the same thing with other sorts of war games too. I mean, in Call of Duty, for instance, hasn't been able to take an enemy's flank because suddenly you had a strong push, you had snipers over here, you had heavy weapons over here, so your opponent is focused, and then you run up in behind and get up in there. Well, that's common, right? And we do that by having that feint. This isn't the actual attack, it's the draw. And then that move around is what we're actually looking for. So any chance that we get for a feint or for a bait, we should take it, because all warfare is based on deception. And on that same idea, we cannot be predictable. If we are predictable, then we have already sacrificed our hand. I have a student, for instance, who every time he strikes first, he strikes with the number 3, and that's a horizontal slash. Every single time. I have yet to see him open up a series of shots with anything other than that. That makes it ridiculously easy for me to counter it. And he's like, oh my goodness, you're so good. Oh my goodness, I can't beat you. But we have to vary it up a little bit. We have to, even if we have a strategy or we have something that we do that is a winning strategy that we use quite frequently, we still need to mix it up, because if I'm your opponent and I want you to use that strategy over and over and over again, I'm going to plan for it. For instance, I play 40K, and one of my primary opponents likes to use the Grey Knights. If you know anything about Warhammer 40K, the Grey Knights, they're all over the place. They like to teleport all over the field. They have incredible mobility in such a way that it's hard to predict. And so I was going against my opponent, and I kept finding that I was pushing forward, and then he would just blink all around me, and I would find myself enveloped. And there's not a whole lot you can do once you become enveloped with those fields of fire. And so what I just determined that I had to do was to keep that flank against something, to really anchor it. So my weak things, I would just march up the side of the board. He can't blink behind me if I'm marching up the side of the board. And so because I knew that he was going to be using this tactic, and thereby all Grey Knights were going to be using this tactic, you have the ability to say, okay, I know where my opponent's strengths are, that extreme mobility. How am I supposed to stop that? How do I put up barriers, or how do I move myself in such a way that that mobility does not hurt me as much as it was? Any questions, contributions so far? Okay. Aggressive versus reactive. It is a balance always between offense and defense. And in fact, most of the folks that you'll study, if you're looking into military science, say that this is one of the hardest things to do, to go from defense to offense, because it usually involves making oneself vulnerable. It usually involves opening oneself up. And then it's a matter of, okay, how aggressive can we be? Well, it depends on your opponent's strategy. You know, if you look at World War II, for instance, the fact that the French were unwilling to bring the fight, the fact that they had a superior army, they had superior equipment, they had superior positioning, but they were unwilling to bring the fight, and they set up in a defensive position, and that allowed the German blitzkrieg to just go right over them, because they had already given up that mobility advantage. And blitzkrieg was a devastating tactic. I mean, you have soldiers that are charged with meth, that also helps a little bit. But it was a very aggressive kind of thing. It was supposed to punch through, and then you get that envelopment because of that superior mobility. And so we want to prevent our opponent from having that, while we do have it. What's up?
Okay, I understand what you're saying. The 2 of the more successful generals in history, Rommel and Robert E. Lee, were often allowed them to attack and keep them up on defense and counter-strike.
And you're absolutely right on that. And that comes from a very, very well-defined and refined tactic. That's not something that just anybody can do. Like you said, Robert E. Lee was known for it, but he was operating with usually inferiorly equipped, inferior in numbers army. And the reason he was able to do it is because he understood that the northern generals were prideful, and that they had one tactic which was kind of like, I'm going to attack here, and then there was the reactive element around it.
Actually, going back to something you previously said, an opponent in Lee's case, he often knew personally his opponent.
He served with them the
So
Mexican
he knew how they would act. That was
Absolutely.
tailored that often.
Yep. I'm sorry.
He was also at West Point.
Yeah, exactly. He went to West Point, and a lot of the people that were facing each other in the American Civil War were, in fact, classmates when they had gone or had served together, and were suddenly like, okay, I know exactly what this guy is going to do. And Lee had the advantage of being the old man when he first took over the Southern Army. Everybody was like, he's a dud. He has such conventional tactics, and he's so tired as a person. There's no way that he's gonna do well. And so he came at them with an energy and with a strategy that they just hadn't seen in him before. Whereas like McClellan and others, they did exactly the same thing that they did during the Mexican-American War.
That was part of the reason he had problems with Grant. He didn't No.
Right. And Grant brought something completely new to the war, which was, I've got men, I've got material, I'm just gonna grind you into the dirt and destroy your logistics, because that's huge. The logistics is a massive, massive part of any military effort, even war gaming as it is right now, making sure that we are prepared. Even so much as if we're gonna have a long, like, World of Warcraft session, making sure that we have food and water and such things on hand, so it's not like, okay, I need to take a break from this dungeon and go and grab some Taco Bell. It's better to just be like, all right, I've got my stuff, I've got it right here, so let's just go with it. And so that transition between aggressive and reactive is difficult. It needs to be practiced quite a bit. That is, by the way, as an aside, that it needs to be practiced quite a bit was one of the most infuriating things that I found when I was first studying military science. A great example of this is Miyamoto Musashi's 5 Rings. Has anybody read that?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand.
Miyamoto Musashi's 5 Rings. It's the book of 5 Rings. It's like a Japanese book on swordsmanship. And almost after every single section, he'll say, and this requires great thought and practice. And sometimes when he's instructed, it's a little vague. But you think you know it. When I studied in high school, for instance, I was like, I know what he's talking about. Yes, the falling maple leaf strike. I know exactly what it is. And then 20 years later, after I had that inferred knowledge all of a sudden, I was like, I didn't understand what he was talking about at all when I first started doing this, because again, you need to study, you need to practice it. That goes in with a lot of this. Everybody, myself included, when you first start looking at this, you're like, okay, where's the immediate arcane knowledge? Where's the secret to doing any of this? And unfortunately, there is no the secret. It is a culmination of all the different knowledge, all the different experience that condenses itself into something that Frederick calls the coup d'etat. And a coup d'etat, Avatar: The Last Airbender. Anybody seen that one? So, do you remember when Sokka is undergoing his swordsmanship training, and his master has him face away, and he's like, turn around, and he sees this gorgeous vista, right? The river and the clouds and the waterfall, and everything is gorgeous. And the master turns him back around and says, draw it. Just as you, and Sokka's like, what do you mean? I saw it for 2 seconds. But what he was trying to demonstrate that right there is this idea of coup d'etat. When you look at something, it's a matter of immediately seeing the situation, immediately seeing the tactical and strategic advantages which are possible to oneself. And that's not possible with just reading even old books. That's not possible just listening to one dude in black give a lecture. It's a matter of study. It's a matter of long time study and long time experience with whatever we're doing. I love that concept of coup d'etat. It took me forever to understand those French concepts. When it comes to being aggressive versus reactive, one of the things that Clausewitz says is that defense is the superior of the 2 forms. And in a lot of ways he's correct, because the defense has the advantage of knowing where the attacker is going, what they need. You know, if they're coming after my capital city, I know where they're coming to, so I can prepare for that accordingly. Also, at the time of Clausewitz, for instance, we're talking about that inferred knowledge. Artillery ruled the field at that particular time. We're talking turn of the century, 1900s, or 1700s. And so at the time, you had masses of artillery that had finally just become standardized. You know, before this point, before the Napoleonic Wars, you had this cannon, that cannon, which were all produced in different forges, which all had different calibers, and trying to come up with parts for each of them, and the repairs and the ammunition for all these different things was nigh impossible. But some of the military scientists that precipitated Napoleon said, standardize it. All the cannons are going to be made in the exact same way. All the parts are going to be done the same way, and they're all going to be interchangeable. And what this enabled was the artillery to rule the field at the time, because again, the infantry had to march across 2 slow-moving formations, and that's not good. I don't know if you've ever seen a slow-moving formation marching into artillery, but not fun. It's not a fun place to be. And so understanding those tactics at the times, when he says the defense is superior, we're talking about artillery sitting at the time. We're not talking at the time of the Blitzkrieg, when Guderian was like, hey, let's try this out. And just blew straight through the manual line. And so the tactics change for everything. For instance, like when we were doing Bellegarde, there were certain tactics and certain positionings that we would use when the flails ruled the field. When it was all about getting around those shields. But those tactics completely changed when it suddenly became about the actual straight swords coming in. Different angles, different lens of attack to worry about. And so the meta constantly changes, and that's part of the reason that there is no absolute template for doing any of this, because the meta changes and that means that everything else changes. So remaining educated in whatever war game you're part of is extremely important. The last thing I want to say on that particular subject is the difference between honor and honor. Actual honor is abiding by the rules of the game, coming at it with like proper intention and proper means to engage. Because again, we're not trying to actually kill people. We're not actually out to rule nations or anything like that. We're having a game with our friends. We're having something fun. So making sure that we abide by the rules and the spirit of the game are important. That being said, there's a difference between that kind of honor and honor. Within Belagarth, for instance, there is a culture around knighthood. And the knights will wear white tablets, and they wear white belts. And a lot of times if a knight is fighting and another knight has their back to them, they will refuse to hit that knight out of some form of honor. No. We have to take every advantage that is available to us. We have to press absolutely every opportunity that comes, because that's the only way that we're going to guarantee victory. You know, I tell my students that all the time. They'll hesitate. If I turn my back to them or something, they'll hesitate hitting me. I say, no. Strike me. Strike me down. I made the mistake of giving my back to you. Even worse, dropping my sword? If I drop my sword, destroy me. That's the same thing with any of the war games too. Unless we're like trying to teach somebody new and we're particularly being nice, trying to hold ourselves back out of some semblance of honor only damages our chances of winning. And so again, abide by the rules of the game, abide by the spirit of the game, but also, if we're trying to win a war game, that means we take absolutely every opportunity that we possibly can. Do you have a comment there, sir? Okay, excellent. So, that's more the interpersonal stuff, more like the war game that takes place between single combatants, usually against each other. Well, I guess it applies to like airsoft, paintball, and other things like that. So, battlefield leadership and strategy. This is the place where a lot of people who are intellectual war gamers will find themselves, because this is the objective. I'm above the field, I'm looking at what's going on, view. So here we have to think about things like army composition. And again, a lot of this stuff is coming from Clausewitz, who was reading, or who was doing his knowledge from the time of the wars. But really, when we think about any war, we have three different branches, if you will. You've got your artillery branch, whatever that consists of. You've got your cavalry branch, whatever that consists of, and infantry. And when I say whatever that consists of, not every game, for instance, a medieval battle game, is going to have large cannons that are firing. And so in that particular case, we're thinking of archers. Anything that has that long reach out and touch you capability. Infantry is your block normal things. Whoever constitutes the core of whatever game we're playing, that's your infantry. And then cavalry is whatever your fast attack is. How do you get in there? How do you get out? Cavalry is one of the most inappropriately used things in all of military science, because in our minds, we think of things like the battle of the field is. Gondor is under siege, Minas Tirith is about to fall, Rohan has arrived. What's the name of that battle? Does anybody remember? But regardless, Rohan advances full charge into a waiting line of orc spears. And part of the reason they're able to do this, of course, is the moral effect of orcs versus the good guys. There's the overwhelming goodness. But tactically speaking, charging an unbroken line with cavalry is a great way to lose your cavalry in anything like that, because cavalry is usually designed for that fast hitting attack thing.
We're talking about going down the slope.
Yeah, that was deep too. Yeah, that one as well.
Right.
This is not working. That's not working. Even with the sun, all you have to do with a glaive or a spear is just, it's just breaks and keep it right there.
The thing is, you're talking similar to like British had square, but you don't want rules.
Right.
They're broken a lot. If they're broken a lot of times, it's a curriculum. Because wars won't do it. They're smarter than the cavalry.
Right.
Is the cavalry dies on the force read into the square and break it.
Okay.
And that's by the way they won up to
breaking through right there, despite the fact that that's a good point. That's a very good point. But for the most part, cavalry is made for the mob. Like cavalry is, especially during this time, cavalry is not something that you hit your opponent with. It was, okay, my opponent is already breaking. That cavalry is already starting to come back. The artillery is already starting to return. At that point, boom, in comes the cavalry with the knockout punch. It's something that's called the pursuit. The whole point of the pursuit is to keep your opponent from reforming, is to keep them from being able to come back with some sort of idea. I do this all the time in 40 game. Just hit one spot really hard, and then while my opponent's trying to get back and get to another objective or bring things together, it's not just carrying them the entire time.
Yeah, I was gonna say cavalry is great for flanking too. If you wanna get around to the archers who are behind the infantry, you can mow down those archers like that.
Oh, absolutely. And even during this time, Clausewitz says, if you can get a clear line of the artillery, you get it. You just get them real quick. That's the best way to go about it. But each of these three things has something that they're very good at and something that they're very bad at. For instance, artillery, with any sort of artillery, that's where you have the highest damage potential, because it's where you have the hardest time actually defending against. Again, we think of these large cannons coming in. Apart from trenches, how are you supposed to deal with cannons? However, they're slow moving. They're a stationary thing, and so they trade off this incredibly high damage potential with being fragile in of themselves. Glass cannons, most wizards. I'm not playing with them in the D&D campaign. The cavalry is your highest mobility, and it's where you're going to find the majority of your personal combat. In particular, this time, apart from the bayonet, there wasn't a whole lot of melee that took place between the armies, except when you had the cavalry and their sabers coming. Exactly, yeah. And so they had the highest mobility and that personal combat. However, that means they're also easily isolated. As you said, they're going for the flank, right? Well, what if that enemy force, what if it has the ability to be like, whoa, and grab that before it gets there? You know, at that point they defeated it, and you've lost out on your cavalry. I hate losing my knight in chess, because they're the highest mobility potential getting in there. But if somebody targets that, you know, that mobility is gone. And so the cavalry have that high mobility, but it also can make them extremely isolated, which is not good in of itself. In the infantry, you find a balance. The infantry is mobile, but not hypermobile. The infantry can have the high damage potential, but doesn't have the highest damage potential. What the infantry is really good at is holding a position, saying, "This is mine now. You're not coming here without a huge fight." And so that is the big use that, especially Clausewitz has found for the infantry, is to make sure you're holding points and advancing to where you want to be with them. Now there is a difference, of course, between newer fighters or newer gamers and vets. Vets kind of know where they're supposed to be instinctively. If you're a sniper within Call of Duty, you kind of know where you're supposed to set up. Okay, I'm supposed to be up here, positioned in this way, so I can get these guys down here. If you're playing a flanker in another sort of game, you kind of know how to set yourself up at the right angle so when that opportunity presents itself, you can get in there and get it. New fighters do not have this, that timing, that education. I see it all the time with, again, some of my students, they're trying to be flankers, or what actually becomes like a backstab, because they just linger in the background. And because of this, they're easily isolated. They're easily hit by other people, and because they're not part of the larger whole. So making sure that we're coaching, especially if we're on a team with these folks, coaching younger people a little bit more about this instinctive feeling is important. It's very important. And it's also important to understand that if we're coming into something new and to say, okay, I don't want to take as many risks as I think are necessary because I don't really know what's going on here. I need to learn the ropes first. And of course, there's a huge difference between fresh and exhausted soldiers. And perhaps in tabletop, this doesn't happen nearly so much, except if you've got like morale phase, like within 40K, there's a morale phase, and people become exhausted and need to fall back, and there's that issue. And fresh troops are always going to be the best. And even though both Napoleon and Clausewitz recommend hitting with all your might, they both still make a provision for reserves, precisely. A reserve is not an inactive component. A reserve is there on purpose. A reserve is there to block a potential flanker, is there to fill a gap, but a reserve is an active position. And we have this image in our mind of the reserve just kind of sitting around, you know, maybe having a cup of coffee or just kind of chatting. No, these are folks who are out and ready to come in. And reserves are crucial They may not seem crucial, but they are crucial for a battle plan because every single battle plan, everybody from Rommel to MacArthur to I'm sure Seneca has said the best plans always fail the second they meet the enemy because we can't anticipate everything our enemy is going to do, which is why we shouldn't come up with a perfect plan. Because what is the perfect plan in one instance will not be the perfect plan in the future. One of the most important things when it comes to something like an RTS, or to even for anything where we command anybody, is the officer competency. How competent are we at actually doing our command? And there are different mental states, there are different personality types that are suited for different levels of command. Not all people are suited to be a general. Otherwise, everybody would be a general. Not all people are suited to be a line sergeant. Even generals might not be suited to be a line sergeant. They have different skill sets. They have different mental approaches to war. A different genius, if you will. Now, genius in the modern age is somebody who is absolutely amazing. It's somebody like Albert Einstein, who just completely revolutionizes their own field. But if you talk about it at this time, or the original Greek meaning of the word, it meant what you're good at. You have a genius, you have a genius, you have a genius. Whatever the thing is that you excel at as a person, that is your personal genius. And so different ones have a different place within the military. For instance, if you have a hot temper, which I myself do sometimes, I have to train myself out of it, but if we're easily provoked, if we have a hot temper, then being in the absolute top of command is not necessarily where we belong. Because then the enemy can provoke us into doing something silly. They can provoke us into revealing something about ourselves that we don't need to. Hotter tempers are better in the line, like a line sergeant, because if they get the order, hey, get up and over that hill, well, that hot temper is going to fuel that unit into getting up and over that hill. Meanwhile, the calm, reserved person being like, hey, we need to go, guys. Not nearly as effective. And so these different geniuses, these different talents are best applied other places. And so what he calls the military genius is that we need to be searching, but not inventive. What he means by that is, instead of trying out something completely new, something that has no grounding in proper theory, we're searching for the situation that fits what we were, the study that fits what we were, what the situation that we're in. Excuse me. We're looking instead for the stuff, applied military science and history that might apply to where we're at. Did Caesar already do what we're trying to do? Why are we trying to improve the wheel, or reinvent the wheel? It doesn't really improve. And so that's what he recommends, being searching but not inventive. But this also means that we don't have to try as hard, I guess. We don't have to waste as much time coming up with a strategy because we can say, okay, it's already been done well. I can consult this and maybe modify it to the situation. Again, most of us are not going to find ourselves in a situation like Caesar did, but it'll be roughly the same and we can kind of go in that same direction. Comprehensive and not specialized. A commander needs to kind of understand every level of what's going on. Obviously, delegating is also important. As the commander, I do not need to directly worry about logistics, for instance. That is the quartermaster's detail. However, I do need to understand how logistics work. I do need to understand, okay, it takes time for wagons to come up and resupply. It takes time for people to rest and get ready between fights. And knowing this means that the general isn't going to be pushing the logistics beyond what they need to do. However, the general does not need to be a specialist in logistics because then they neglect things like the artillery or like the infantry. And understanding a little bit about each of them is how a general really makes sure that they understand how the entire machine works together, because it's always a military machine, whether or not we're fighting personally, or whether or not we're commanding an army on the field. It is all guided by the same effort, by the same impulse, by the same goal. And so recognizing this as a commander and thinking about it as that, and not just separate sections that need different specialists, but trying to comprehensively understand everything is very, very important. And of course, a cool head. We can all be baited. I can be baited. Unless you're a Buddhist monk that has spent their entire time in isolation, just, focusing on calmness, we can all be baited. So understanding that about ourselves means that we're less likely to be baited into something. Because if we're angry, we're likely to make a mistake. I'm likely to make a mistake. And so we have to make sure that we've got that cool head. And that's one of those big things that it's one of those kind of necessary traits for a good commander, is to have that cool head. Again, line commander, somebody who's supposed to be running up there and getting the job done, like personally, Fire temper is good then. You want somebody who's ready and willing to get into it. But above, it needs to be more of a cool head sort of situation. And then we're looking at science versus art. And this almost seems like it contradicts the very first point that he makes, which is that we need to be searching, but not inventing. But if we're looking at it as an absolute science with defined parameters and those theories which are in stone, we're going to be defeated. Because doing exactly what somebody did before and having that an actual science to it is detrimental to our own war effort. And so it needs to become that art. It needs to become being part of that coup d'etat, where it's instinctive, where it's intuitive. And by doing that, we can actually apply it in such a way that it becomes art and not just something rigid, not just something purely scientific. This is where we get into more of that Robert E. Lee kind of idea, which is the numeric differences. In most general situations, especially in this era of warfare that we're currently studying the art of war, numbers matter. And in most areas of war, numbers matter. Even if you've got inferior equipment, sometimes if you've even got inferior spirit, just throwing people. Anybody who knows the Imperial Guard from Warhammer 40K, numbers matter. Even if it is just to choke up the opponent's machines. However, people like Lee constantly defy that particular law. Frederick the Great, if you study his wars, the wars in Silesia and whatnot, when he took on most of Europe, he was inferior numerically, and yet he managed to win like just about every single one of his engagements. How did he do this? He had something that's called local numeric superiority. And the idea there is, even though you may have 10,000 fighters and I have 5,000, if you split your army up into different 2,000 fighter groups, if I concentrate all of my 5,000 on this and on this and on this, I can take an army apart piecemeal, even though I am technically at a numeric disadvantage. And this is something that's important for just about whatever we do, especially if we find ourselves at that numeric inferiority. Now, this takes mobility. This takes the willingness to be able to move where one needs to move, or because, like Frederick used the oblique, which is he would kind of turn his line and march down the opponent's line, even while saying with the bait, hey, I'm over here, just coming down and having that local numeric superiority all the way down, defeating his opponents. So we need to find ways to do that, because we will at times find ourselves outnumbered and outmatched. So it's that maneuver, it's that ability to say, okay, the larger battlefield is now being defined as this micro battlefield. On this micro battlefield, my numbers are key. Especially if you're operating like I do Space Marine armies, for instance, with Warhammer 40K, so I'm often at a numeric disadvantage. So making sure to concentrate, which is also what Napoleon did. He had an obliteration tactic, which is just, hey, officer of the artillery, you see that unit on the ridge line? I don't want to. And everybody targeting that point until you can break right through. And that also comes into the attrition idea. Once you can do this, you can ride through your opponent, breaking down their morale, breaking down their own troops and their supply lines, which is also important. And this also draws directly into asymmetric warfare, which is what we see largely right now. If you look at real warfare going on in the world, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, the war that is taking place in Yemen right now, these are wars that are defined as asymmetrical, where you have one force. I mean, take the war in Afghanistan, either of them, the Soviet occupation, the British occupation, the American occupation, any of those, if you look at it, you have one force which is obviously superior. The Soviets, when they occupied Afghanistan, had by far the greatest army on the planet. They are the greatest army that had existed up until that point on the planet. America, the world superpower, was recently there for 20 years. And in both cases, these guys who are lugging around old, dirty AK-47s managed to beat these world superpowers. How did they do it? Asymmetrical warfare. They didn't fight them. They didn't line up. When George Washington was first fighting the British, he tried to line everybody up in these conventional tactics. The British were the best at it. They were amazing at what they did. And so it wasn't until Washington switched it up and started using more asymmetrical tactics that really started to break down. And by the end of the war, it was easier. At the end of the war, that discipline.
Yorktown was a conventional battle.
Was that?
Yorktown was a conventional battle.
That's true. That is true. And of course, there are, and I'm not saying that Washington wasn't a good commander. When you're talking about the difference between the experience with conventional warfare with the Redcoats versus the Continentals, in most places it was absolutely overwhelming. Absolutely. And so, And there's a lot of rules to it. We did an entire section on asymmetrical warfare. We actually studied the book of Abu Bakr Naji, and he was the foremost thinker for Al Qaeda. His writings disseminated absolutely everywhere. They're on all the different websites there. I got it through the Department of Defense. But it's a playbook. They still use it right now. For instance, I'm going to go on a slight tirade for a second. Hamas. You hear about the attacks between Israel and Palestine, and the almost overwhelming response that you see from Israel coming in there. Well, that's intentional, not on Israel's part, but Hamas's part. Because Hamas knows, okay, we fire a few rockets from this position, and then we scoot, we're out of here. But the Israelis, the conventional power, they're still here, and they level a whole lot, trying to get these guys who aren't there anymore. And then they kill somebody's own team. And that person says, well, why don't I just join Hamas? And so that happens.
I have to disagree. Israel has been taking very care to avoid collateral damage.
Well, when they have,
Hamas is using human shields.
yes. I'm not saying this is good. By the way, this is not a good moral tactic by any chance, or by any stretch of the words, but it was used all the time in Afghanistan too. It was used to great effect because the Taliban had spies, naturally, within the infrastructure, the normal military infrastructure. And so by the time that they were like, okay, we're going to go into this valley, we're going to attack this Al-Qaeda outpost, or this Taliban outpost, they were gone. What they did do was damage the civilian population. And because of this, they actually gave recruits to the Hamas, or to the Taliban, or to Al-Qaeda. And so it seems to be a counterproductive sort of idea.
We have a question in the back.
Okay.
Yeah, no, just talking about the Taliban. So the United States said the enemy of our enemy is our friend.
Right.
So we helped train the Taliban to fight the Soviet Union, and we taught them how to build the caves and how to strike, run away, and hide. So we kind of created that.
Well, absolutely, we did. Absolutely, it was one of those things where we brought in the mongooses to take out the snakes, and then the mongooses ended up ruling the island and killing everything else. So, the cure can sometimes be worse than the disease itself. Skip the page too early. And with that idea of combat attrition, war does not often consist of one decisive blow. The movies like to make it seem so, which you've got the one army that rides out, the other army that rides out, and that moment the war is over. The vast majority of war, the vast majority of war gaming is not done in a decisive blow, but in a slow attrition against our enemy, leading to some sort of decisive blow. When it first starts off, we're thinking about the long game. We're thinking about the ways that we can prosecute this war in such a way that we retain our numbers while depleting our opponent's numbers. And so making sure that we know that, making sure that we don't expect that first battle or that the early battles aren't going to be decisive, means we're not going to be disappointed or overcommit our troops in any particular case. And when we're thinking about the defense, what do we want to use? To use football terms for a moment. Man-to-man or zone defense. It really matters who we're going against. It really matters what their tactics are, how they're going to be coming at us so far. Do we try to protect a given area against folks, or do I say, okay, I'm going after that person, I'm going after that person? Well, again, this leads back to the idea of understanding one's enemy, understanding what somebody needs in order to prosecute against that enemy in a good way. So we're dealing with our basic forces in terms of even just physics when it comes to wargaming. You have two kinds of forces. You have convergent forces, forces that are moving towards something, and divergent forces, which are forces moving away from something, as the words imply. Convergent forces, if they're able to go on one given position, it changes the numbers. It goes from being something like this. Because if you think of forces coming together, you would think of it being, X, which is our end force, is equal to A plus B, is the way that it would kind of make sense. When in fact, our X is equal to A times B, because every force that we're able to come at something with, particularly with different angles, magnifies the potential for victory rather than just adding to it. And so when we're thinking about the convergent forces, we want to think about them all going towards that one area. Think again of Napoleon, saying that ridgeline is gone. Well, once the ridgeline is gone, he moved all of his forces there in one fell swoop before the enemy was able to react. And so making sure that you have those convergent forces is huge. And of course, you can take crossfire into account. We can put we've got multiple angles on them for whatever we're doing, that multiplies the damage that we're able to do to them. And of course, that also enables us to cut off retreat. Part of the point of being part of the converging forces is to converge around our target and cut off defeat. So those are the kind of advantages the convergent forces have. Divergent forces have the ability to have interior lines. So the interior lines is also something that's really cool. So if I've got this circle, and my convergent or my divergent force is going outwards, and my convergent force is coming inwards, let's say that there's another attack over here. Who's going to get there faster for a reinforcement? The vendor will, absolutely, because they only have this line, this interior line. If you look at there, this particular attacker is all the way around here. And so if our defender is using those interior lines, it makes it far easier to defend even against a numerically superior foe. Again, I draw the example back to Frederick the Great, who used his interior lines to great effect. He said, okay, the Russians are over here, boom, British are coming from over here, boom. And was just able to move on that axis because of his infrastructure was there. He had a bunch of magazines and depots that were set up, and was able to absolutely do what was necessary. My wonderful wife/assistant back there is telling me that we are getting low on time, so I think we might just stop there with the divergent forces. Again, I probably got about 45 minutes left of material, but I think they're going to kick me out. Any questions? Well, I've got you for a few more minutes.
Okay, this is totally off subject of what you were talking about.
Okay.
It's related. There are 2 sessions on AI. Do you have any comments about AI is going to affect military affairs?
Yes. Every new piece, what he was asking is, will AI affect military affairs? Absolutely. Every new technology that comes out affects military affairs. Duct tape affects military affairs. Half of the military activity is how to strategically apply duct tape. So there's so many different things. The cannons, the idea of gunpowder. Gunpowder was first invented for command and signal. It was a matter of saying, okay, when this particular sign comes up here, when this firework goes up kind of over here, it means this. When it happens over here, it means this, rather than flags and gongs and that sort of thing. It was brilliant for some of the dynasties of China to adopt that. And then it kind of came over to Europe, and they were like, we can make projectile with this, yeah, we got this. And so this almost innocuous substance, or dynamite was kind of the same idea, that combination. When Nobel first made dynamite, he was intending it to be used strictly for engineering purposes. It was not. It certainly has been used for many, many other things, which is part of the reason he came up with the whole Nobel Peace Prize to kind of counteract what he considered was the greatest evil he'd ever done, Oppenheimer, and the division of the atom. We can use it for all sorts of clean energy in a lot of cases. However, it can also be used as the most devastating weapon that has been currently done by humanity. So if you ask, will AI affect military affairs? Absolutely. Absolutely.
What effects do you think?
What effects do I think?
Yes, I think everybody figures it's going to
Oh, okay. What effect? I would say that, well, if we look at drones, for instance, the drone has replaced the need for a person to be there in person. You can use a drone to do a surgical strike anywhere in the world, and the person operating that drone can be at home in their jammies. And so that little piece of technology is massive, and so military science, for instance, can be applied. Most of us play against NPCs. If we're not doing a PvP game, we're going against an NPC. That NPC is driven by AI. Well, imagine what's going to happen when we're able to apply that AI to something within military science. And so, will it be applied? Yes. Will it be applied to many things, including like targeting would be one place where I would absolutely think that AI would be extremely useful. Smart bombs? Yep.
Officers use it to protect what the enemy's gonna do. You can analyze a tremendous amount of data.
Precisely.
And make a prediction better than we can.
Yep, we got literally a computer that is able to crunch this data better. What you got there?
So, I missed the first few minutes. I know you got the ancient art of war up there, Sun Tzu. Why don't more military leaders follow that? I know Genghis Khan did, and he has only one loss to his name, but he wasn't actually there, it was his lieutenant. So, I mean, General Powell followed it, but I mean, why aren't more people trying to focus and look at that and look at those aspects of it?
I think they're falling into the trap which Clausewitz had talked about. Rather than searching, they're trying to be inventive. Rather than looking back at what we know works, Wars, which again, Sun Tzu's Art of War was the first book that we actually studied for the art of wargaming. It's a foundation for military science. If you're a part of the military science community and you haven't read the Art of War, like that's like the one-on-one entry level book to kind of understand.
Every Army lieutenant reads it as part of the curriculum, every single officer program that the U.S. military does.
Precisely. They think they can do better than
Yeah.
that. So instead of building upon what we had previously, instead of looking at what was done right, like the art of war, we instead try to be inventive. And it's when we try to be inventive in that way that we really end up screwing ourselves. And it appears that I am out of time. But thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much for your contribution.